Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another of our Commander's Guild deck text. This is deck number 224 and it's titled Dreadmaw after Dreadmaw after Dreadmaw. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So our random card today was suggested to us by Doodle over on Discord, and he suggested his personal favorite card, which is Colossal Dreadmaw. A great memeable card for Magic the Gathering. It is 4 green for a 6/6 dinosaur with Trample. That's it. Nice and simple, very clean, effective type of card. Now, unfortunately, it is not a legend, so therefore it cannot be our commander for today. So our commander, I wanted to fit the theme a little bit, so I thought, what's another green 6/6 with Trample? And that led me to Vorinclex. So Vorinclex is 3 green for a 6/6 legendary creature Phyrexian Praetor. It's got Trample, Reach. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for up to 2 forest cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle. Then you can spend 6 green to exile Vorinclex and return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control, but only as a sorcery. Now, if you transform Vorinclex, it'll turn into the Grand Evolution, which is an enchantment saga. At lore counter 1, you mill 10 cards, then put up to 2 creature cards from among the milled cards onto the battlefield. Lore counter 2, distribute 7 +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures you control. And lore counter 3, until the end of turn, creatures you gain control pay 1. This creature fights target creature you don't control. Exile the Grand Evolution and return it to the battlefield face up. Notably, when you return it to the battlefield face up, Vorinclex will enter and you'll get 2 more forests out of the deal, so pretty solid overall. But the nice thing about Vorinclex is that it doesn't necessarily synergize specifically with Colossal Dreadmaw, but it does work very well with Colossal Dreadmaw because it means we can get it for free out of our graveyard with the Grand Evolution. We can get the forests needed to ramp into it. We can put counters on the Dreadmaw, which, since it has Trample, is very useful. And then we can fight things down because a 6/6 is going to be bigger than most of our opponent's creatures. Anyway, that is our commander for this week. So the next thing I want to do is take a look at some themes for the deck and what really ties everything together. So the very first theme is a little bit of an odd one, so bear with me. It is Dreadmaws. In other words, 6/6s with Trample. There are a ton of them in green, and not all of them are 6 mana 6/6s with Trample. Some of them may have additional abilities, some of them may cost more or cost less, but every single major creature in here, aside from some support pieces, are 6/6 creatures with Trample. A good example is Bramble Weft Behemoth, which is 4 green for a 6/6 elemental with Trample. So it is the exact same card as Colossal Dreadmaw. The only difference is that it is an elemental instead of a dinosaur. So I went pretty deep on some of these, so if you're looking through the deck list and you see some cards that look a little bit, we'll say unsynergistic, I guarantee you they're in there because they are 6/6 creatures with Trample. Moving on to our second theme of the deck, since we have so many 6-powered creatures, we may as well benefit from having those 6-power creatures. So we have cards that care about creatures with power 3, 4, or sometimes even 5 or greater. A good example of that is Elemental Bond, which is 2 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So since we plan on putting so many big creatures into play, we want to make sure that we have efficient card draw engines, and there's quite a few cards that reward us for playing big creatures, and a lot of them let us draw cards, so we can continue to refill our hand and continue to dump these big creatures into play. Moving on to our final theme, you can probably guess what it is based on our first 2 themes. It is ramp. We need to make sure we can actually get these creatures into play because our mana curve kind of starts at 5. And if we're really starting to play our deck starting at mana 5, then we need to make sure we have earlier cards to get more lands into play. And lucky for us, that is something that green is very, very good at. So a good example of what we're trying to do is Harrow, which is 2 and a green for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a land, then search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle. So this is essentially a 3 mana instant speed, get an extra land, because we do have to go down a land and then up 2. But being able to do this at the end of an opponent's turn means we can go from, say, 5 mana up to 7 mana on our turn, meaning we can immediately start dropping much bigger creatures very, very quickly, and if we get enough mana, we can actually drop multiple 6/6s with Trample in a single turn. That, though, is the end of our themes for today. So the next thing I want to do is take a look at some key cards in the deck. And these are cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do, and in a lot of cases are win conditions, value engines, or just kind of like the MVPs of the deck. So starting off, our first key card is the Skull Spore Nexus. And the Skull Spore Nexus is a little bit of a weird card, but it is 6 green for a legendary artifact that costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Notably, since we have so many 6/6s with Trample, the Nexus will almost always just be 2 green mana, and whenever 1 or more non-token creatures you control die, create a green fungus dinosaur creature token with base power and toughness each equal to the total power of those creatures. Then you can pay 2 and tap it to double target creature's power until the end of turn. This is incredibly useful in a couple of different ways. One, being able to double a creature's power means that all of our 6/6s with Trample just become 12/12s, and that can really just close out games very quickly. But it also protects us from a lot of board wipes, or even from our opponent's blocking. So one of the big things that can stop us is, of course, a board wipe. If we have, 5 6/6 creatures and someone wipes the board, we're kind of unhappy. But with the Skullspore Nexus, if we have 5 6/6s, we actually just add total all of their power and make one giant fungus dinosaur token, which can then start hitting our opponents. Now, the other thing that can really stop us is like little death touch creatures, or maybe tokens if our opponents have a lot of them. So being able to double our creature's power at instant speed to trample over those things, and then also being able to replace our dinosaurs or our 6/6s when they die with other tokens, means we don't have to be afraid of sending in our big creatures to die to little things if we have a way to ensure that we get something out of it. That, though, is only keycard number 1. So moving on to keycard number 2, we have Defiler of Vigor. And Defiler of Vigor is 3 green for a 6/6 Phyrexian worm. It has Trample. As an additional cost to cast green permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost 1 green mana less to cast if you paid life this way, but this only reduces the amount of green mana you pay, so we can't use it for colorless. And whenever you cast a green permanent spell, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Once again, Defiler, 6/6, Trample, perfect. However, this is one of the best and most efficient ways for us to increase the power of our creatures. Because if we can put +1/+1 counters on each creature we control, guaranteeing that 90% of our creatures have Trample, we can get through with combat damage a lot more often than we may be able to otherwise, and we have a lot of green permanent spells in this deck. In fact, the vast majority of our spells are permanents, which means we can cast them cheaper, using essentially Phyrexian mana to cast them, and put counters on our stuff every time we cast it. It's also worth noting that we don't have to have the spell resolve to get the +1/+1 counters. We just have to cast it, then we get the counters, so if someone does wind up countering our spells, we still get the +1/+1 boost. Moving on though, to our third key card in the deck. This one is Wild Pair, and I am a huge fan of Wild Pair in this deck. I do want to shout out my Discord for bringing this card to my attention. It is 4 green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature comes into play, if you played it from your hand, you may search your library for a creature card with the same total power and toughness and put it into play. If you do, shuffle your library. Since we are built specifically around 6/6 creatures with Trample, almost every creature we play will have a total combined power and toughness of 12, meaning we can then search our library for any other of our 6/6s with Trample and put it directly into play. And if we're putting 2 6/6s with Trample into play for every spell we are casting, we are skyrocketing ahead of our opponents in this game. We are pushing ourselves so far ahead that it's going to be really tough for our opponents to block our creatures, tough for them to kill our creatures, and tough for them to stop us, because we do have some creatures that deal with enter the battlefield effects or have some other upside other than just the 6/6 with Trample, so we can kind of pick and choose the cards we need at any given moment and use that as a way to outvalue the rest of the table. Anyway though, moving on from our key cards, the next thing we're going to talk about are some cool interactions in the deck. And these are cards that really synergize well with our themes, but are also in a lot of cases just some fun cards that I want to highlight. So first up, our first cool interaction is between Sereth the Viper's Fang and Living Hive. So Sereth is 2 green for a 3/4 legendary creature human warlock. I know it's blasphemous that she's not a 6/6 with Trample, but trust me, she's in here for a very good reason. She says other tapped creatures we control have Death Touch, other untapped creatures we control have Hexproof, and we can pay 1 and tap her to untap another target creature or land we control. Sereth is by far one of my favorite protection spells in mono green. Giving everything Hexproof is incredibly powerful, but the main reason she's actually in this deck is for giving our tapped creatures Death Touch. Now, a unique interaction with Death Touch and Trample is that when an opponent blocks a creature with Death Touch and Trample, we only have to assign lethal damage to that creature before the rest of it tramples over. Since the creature has Death Touch, any amount of damage is lethal. This means that our opponents can block a 10/10 creature with their 10/10 creature. We only have to assign 1 damage to the blocker and the other 9 can trample over to our opponents. So the fact that everything has Trample and Sereth gives Death Touch is incredibly powerful and kind of game breaking if you use it properly. One of the best cards to use with Sereth and her Death Touch ability, though, is Living Hive, which is 6 green for an elemental with the magical 6/6 and Trample. And when it deals combat damage to a player, put that many 1/1 green insect creature tokens into play. So because of what we just talked about with the Trample and Death Touch, if Living Hive is blocked at all by just a single creature, all of that damage except for 1 will be able to trample over, and we'll get 5 1/1 insect creature tokens. And in fact, the only way that our opponents could stop us from making any insect tokens is if they block Living Hive with 6 different creatures to guarantee we get no combat damage through. And that is incredibly painful for someone who wants to block, and lose 6 creatures, or let it through and let us make 6 creatures. So it really puts our opponents in a difficult position. And because of that, I think Sereth could probably be a key card, but I did want to highlight her interaction with a Trample creature, and one in particular that really wants to do damage. Moving on though, to our next cool interaction, we have Ancient Imperiosaur and Traverse the Outlands. Now, Ancient Imperiosaur, 5 green for a 6/6 creature dinosaur. It's got Convoke, Trample, Ward 2, and it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it for each creature that convoked it. Traverse the Outlands is 4 and a green for a sorcery that says search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Put those cards onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So since most of our creatures are going to be 6/6 creatures, with Trample of course, then Traverse the Outlands is 5 mana to search our library for 6 basic lands and put them into play, essentially doubling our mana at the time. Or, if we have Ancient Imperiosaur, and we have somehow managed to convoke all 7 pips of its mana, then Ancient Imperiosaur will actually enter with 20 power, meaning Traverse the Outlands is 5 mana, search your library for 20 forests, and put them into play tapped. That gets almost every single basic land out of our deck, and obviously that is kind of like a magical Christmas land. It's very unlikely for that to happen, but even a couple of +1/+1 counters, if we can convoke 2, maybe 3 for Ancient Imperiosaur, means that we are getting 8, 10, 12 lands out of our deck, and even that is a tremendous boost in power. So I really wanted to highlight Ancient Imperiosaur for this because it is the creature that can grow the largest on its own. Obviously we have some +1/+1 counter synergies that can grow things past 20 power, but this is the best on its base. Anyway though, those are all of our cool interactions for today. So the next thing we're going to do is take a look at the price of the deck, which came in today at $90.34, with the most expensive card in the deck being Vigor at $15.48, a huge chunk of our budget. Now, that being said, I do think Vigor is actually a very important piece to this deck. We don't have a ton of ways to protect our creatures if someone decides to throw a bunch of blockers in front of them, but Vigor is a great way we can do that, because it is 3 green for a 6/6 Trample, of course, creature with an elemental incarnation as its creature type, and if damage would be dealt to another creature you control, prevent that damage, and put a +1/+1 counter on that creature for each 1 damage prevented this way. Then, whenever Vigor is put into a graveyard from anywhere, shuffle it into its owner's library. So the way that this would work is if we are attacking someone with a 6/6 creature and they block with a 6/6 creature, then our creature will prevent the 6 damage done to it. It will then get 6 +1/+1 counters and become a 12/12 while still killing the opposing blocker. So this puts us in a position where we can just kind of keep attacking with a little bit of reckless abandon and know that our creatures will survive combat, and not only will they survive combat, but our opponents are put in a situation where they can either take the 6 damage now, or they can block the creature, grow it, and take more damage in the future. So Vigor, incredibly powerful in the deck, a phenomenal way to push through combat damage, and also kind of a sneaky way to avoid getting milled out because it shuffles its way back in, so another nice little bonus. That being said though, if you did need to trim down on budget, obviously this will be the first card you cut because it is a huge portion of the budget. However though, if you're looking to add a little bit to the budget and maybe have some cards laying around, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. Now, the card that I'm going to suggest is so far out of our budget range, it's not even funny, because it is a massive $66 for the Great Henge. Now, the Great Henge, kind of a staple for mono green, but I think that in this deck it shines even more because the Great Henge is 7 green for a legendary artifact. This spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. You can tap it to add green and gain 2 life, and whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. If we have our 6/6s, which I imagine we will, also with Trample, very important, then the Great Henge will only cost us 3 mana. It will then come in, immediately be able to tap for 2 mana, which means it technically only cost us 1 mana. It then starts gaining us life, it starts putting +1/+1 counters on our creatures, and it starts drawing us cards. There is a very good reason that the Great Henge is $66 and well out of our price range, but if you happen to have one laying around, I think that it would be a tremendous boost in power to this deck. That being said, if you are putting a card into the deck, obviously you got to take a card out of the deck as well. And the card I would recommend taking out is Wumpus Aberration, which is 3 and a green for a 6/6 Eldrazi beast with Devoid. When you cast this spell, if colorless mana wasn't spent to cast it, target opponent may put a creature card from their hand onto the battlefield, then it has Trample. Now, I'm a big fan of cards that kind of pump up one opponent. You kind of get to play the politics of it. However, it is nice to have the option to not play the politics of it, and with Wumpus Aberration, we do need colorless mana. We have some sources of colorless mana in the deck, but because we have a lot of ways to search out basic lands and specifically forests, we don't have as many as I would like to consider this a decent playable card. Now, it is still very good. It's a 4 mana 6/6 with Trample, which is solid, but when compared to the Great Henge, it really does fall flat, and I think that if you included more colorless mana sources in the deck, then I do think Wumpus Aberration becomes better, because if you can negate the downside of it, then it's just a 4 mana 6/6, which is an absurd rate for green creatures. Anyway though, that brings us to the end of our deck tech for today, and before we jump into a game with this deck, I do want to take a second to shout out our current patrons and channel members, as well as let everyone know that if you would like to join that amazing list of people, you can find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. Now, if that's not where you want to be at the moment, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That really does help out a lot. We are so incredibly close to the goal of 2,000 subscribers, and my goal was originally to hit it by the end of June. We're only a couple days away, so if you could help share the video with some friends, get us to that 2,000, I would really appreciate it. Other than that, though, I have one last shout out before we move on to the game, and that is a bit of a self shout out. I and my wife have made a separate YouTube channel right here, obviously on YouTube, where we have been playing through some video games in our spare time and just kind of having some fun doing it. Right now, it's still getting off the ground. We've only got 4 videos. There's actually going to be a 5th one going up later today, if that's something you're interested in. But we've been playing Oblivion Remastered, we've been playing Date Everything, and I also accidentally recorded some Dead Cells without some commentary, so that's on there as well, and it's somehow the most popular one, so there's a solid chance you'll see more Dead Cells in the future. But if you could go over, subscribe to it, maybe watch a couple videos, I would really appreciate it. And also, I would love some feedback if there's anything you think could be improved. I know about the audio issues on the first Oblivion episode. Don't stress about that one. Other than that, though, I think that's enough rambling from me. So let's move on to our game this week and see who our opponents are going to be. As always, we are joined by 3 opponents. This time, it is going to be Jason playing Felothar, Dawn of the Abzan, Bilal playing the Wise Mothman, and Doodle playing the Swarm Lord. So starting off with Jason and his Felothar deck, this deck is very much kind of just what Jason wants to be doing. I don't really know how to describe it other than that. It's +1/+1 counters, it's got black in it, it's got white in it, and it's got sacrifice synergies. So it is very much a Jason style of deck. So I'm honestly a little bit spooked by this deck because I know he's very good at playing aristocrat strategies. And so I know that there's probably going to be a lot of hidden tricks in there that I don't expect, but that he knows how they work. So I think that that is a very scary deck at the table. However, I don't think it's the scariest deck at the table. I think that award goes to Bilal and his Mothman deck. I have played Mothman myself. I have the precon just unedited as it is. I've got a lot of Mothman players in our playgroup. I know Jason has a Mothman deck. I know Bilal does. I think a couple of other people may as well. But it is a commander that hits hard very, very fast, comes out of the gate as a 3/3, and by the time it gets to attack for the first time, it's probably swinging for 7+. So it's very powerful, very fast, and I know Bilal has a bit of a taste for combo, shall we say. So I'm sure there are some sneaky combos in here that can grow Mothman to lethal almost immediately. So this is definitely the deck at the table that I'm the most concerned about. Finally, though, we have our third opponent at the table, Doodle, with the Swarmlord, and this is exactly what you expect a Swarmlord deck to be. This is all about Tyranids, +1/+1 counters, and just kind of beating face, which I am a big fan of in Commander. I love being the aggressive deck at the table, and I imagine Tyranids are going to be really good at that. So I'm very excited to see what Doodle's got cooked up over there. He's always got some sweet deck ideas. Anyway, though, those are all of our opponents for this week. Let me know down in the comments who you think might walk away the winner. I'm very interested to see how this goes. I'm hoping everybody else is as well. Make sure, if you haven't already, to like the video, subscribe to the channel. But let's jump into this game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Jason, Bilal, and then Doodle. On my first turn, I play a forest. Jason plays a fortified village, revealing a forest from his hand so it comes into play untapped, and casts an Elves of Deep Shadow. Bilal plays a forest, casts a Soul Ring, and then also casts a Talisman of Curiosity. Doodle plays a Path of Ancestry. I play an Arid Archway, returning a forest to my hand, and then discarding to hand size, discarding a Wrecking Beast. Jason casts an Orzhov Signet and plays a Temple of Plenty, scrying 1. Bilal casts Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into his hand and the other into play tapped. Then he plays the island he just tutored for, so he can cast Vexing Radgull, proliferating when it deals combat damage to a player if that player has a rad counter, otherwise giving that player a rad counter. Doodle plays an Exotic Orchard. I play a forest and cast Colossal Majesty, drawing a card in my upkeep if I control a creature with power 4 or greater. Jason plays a swamp and casts Revival of the Ancestors, creating 3 1/1 spirit tokens, then finally attacks me for 1 with Elves of Deep Shadow. Bilal cast his commander, the Wise Mothman, giving each player a rad counter when it enters or attacks, and then putting a +1/+1 counter on up to X creatures whenever X non-land cards are milled. Then he's able to attack me for 1 with the Radgull, proliferating when it deals damage. On Doodle's turn, he mills 2 non-lands for his rad counters, losing 2 life, losing both rad counters, and then Bilal puts a +1/+1 counter on both of his creatures. Doodle then plays a mountain, casts a Herald's Horn, naming Tyranid, so all his Tyranids cost 1 less to cast, and in his upkeep, he can reveal the top card of his library and put it into his hand if it's a Tyranid. On my turn, I mill 2 non-lands, losing 2 life, losing both rad counters, and Bilal puts a counter on both of his creatures. After that, I play a forest and cast Drum Hunter, now drawing a card in my end step if I control a creature with power 4 or greater. On Jason's turn, he mills 2 non-lands, losing 2 life, losing 2 rad counters, and letting Bilal put a +1/+1 counter on both of his creatures. Then his Saga goes to Lore Counter 2, distributing 3 +1/+1 counters among his spirit tokens, and he also plays a Woodland Cemetery. After that, he casts his commander, Felithar, Dawn of the Abzan, sacrificing a creature when she enters or attacks, and then putting a +1/+1 counter on each creature he controls. With this trigger, he sacrifices Elves of Deep Shadow to put a counter on his entire board. After that, Jason attacks both Doodle and I with a Spirit for 3 damage. In his second main phase, Jason cast a Talisman of Resilience and a Talisman of Hierarchy. On Bilal's turn, he mills a land and a non-land, losing a life, losing a rad counter, and putting a +1/+1 counter on the Radgull. Then he casts Toski, Bearer of Secrets, now letting him draw a card whenever a creature he controls deals combat damage to a player. This lets Bilal attack Doodle for 6 with Mothman, and attack me for 5 with the Radgull, giving each player a rad counter, proliferating all the rad counters as well as Jason's creatures, then also drawing Bilal 2 cards. In his second main phase, Bilal plays an island and passes. On Doodle's turn, he mills a land and a non-land, losing a life, losing a rad counter, and Bilal puts a +1/+1 counter on Toski. After that, Doodle casts Haruspex, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever another creature dies. On my turn, I mill a land and a non-land, losing a life, losing a rad counter, and Bilal puts a +1/+1 counter on Toski. After that, I cast my commander, Vorinclex, searching my library for 2 forests and putting them into my hand. Then I play a Mosswort Bridge, hiding away a card, and at the end of turn, I draw a card thanks to the Drum Hunter. On Jason's turn, his Saga reaches lore counter 3, being sacrificed and giving all his creatures Trample and lifelink until the end of turn. Then he mills 2 lands for his rad counters, plays a forest, and casts Armorcraft Judge, drawing 4 cards when it enters since he controls 4 creatures that have a +1/+1 counter. Once that resolves, he attacks me with Felithar and 2 spirit tokens, sacrificing the Judge on attacks to put another +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures. I'm able to block one of the spirits with Vorinclex, killing it and only taking 11 damage, while Jason gains 16 life. Also, since 2 creatures died, Doodle puts 2 counters on his Haruspex. In Jason's second main phase, he casts a Llanowar Elves, then passes. On Bilal's turn, he mills a land and 2 non-lands, losing 2 life, losing 2 rad counters, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Toski and Mothman. He then plays a Woodland Cemetery and casts Psychic Corrosion, now milling each opponent for 2 whenever he draws a card. After that, he attacks Doodle for 4 with Toski, and attacks me with the Radgull for 6. I block with Vorinclex, killing my commander but taking no damage, while Doodle takes 4 and Bilal draws a card, which also mills each of his opponents for 2, hitting a total of 1 non-land, so Bilal puts a +1/+1 counter on his commander. On Doodle's turn, he mills a land for his rad counter, then casts Court of Garenbrig, becoming the monarch and distributing 2 +1/+1 counters among his creatures in his upkeep. Then, if he's still the monarch, doubling the counters on all his creatures. After that, he moves to his end step and draws a card. On my turn, I mill a non-land, losing a life, losing a rad counter, and letting Bilal put a +1/+1 counter on Mothman. I then play a forest and recast my commander Vorinclex, again searching my library for 2 forests and putting them into my hand. Then, when I move to my end step, I draw a card with the Drum Hunter. On Jason's turn, he mills a land and a non-land, losing a life, losing a rad counter, and letting Bilal put a +1/+1 counter on Toski. After that, Jason casts Solemn Simulacrum, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. He then plays a Twilight Mire and attacks Bilal with his entire board, sacrificing Solemn Simulacrum to draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter on each creature he controls. Bilal blocks Felithar with Mothman, killing Jason's commander but still taking 13 damage. Then in his second main phase, Jason casts Sign in Blood, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life, and then also casts Hollow Merc Siege, but this time Bilal has an answer, countering the enchantment with a Sinister Sabotage, also letting Bilal surveil 1. On Bilal's turn, he draws a card, making each opponent mill 2, which includes 3 non-lands, so Bilal puts a +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures. Then he also mills a non-land for his rad counter, losing a life, losing his rad counter, and putting another +1/+1 counter on Mothman. After that, he plays a command tower and moves to combat, where Doodle flashes in Ravener for x=1, entering with a +1/+1 counter and forcing Mothman to attack Jason this turn. This means Bilal attacks Jason with his entire board for 23 total damage, giving each player a rad counter, proliferating, letting Bilal draw 3 cards, making each of his opponents mill 6 cards, and putting 3 +1/+1 counters on each of his creatures, since each Psychic Corrosion trigger individually triggers Mothman. In his second main phase, Bilal plays an Exotic Orchard, which he couldn't have done since he'd already played a land this turn, and cast Nuclear Fallout for x=4, giving each creature -8/-8, and giving each player 4 rad counters. This winds up killing all creatures in play except for Bilal's. In Doodle's upkeep, he reveals a Broodlord with Herald's Horn, putting it into his hand, then he mills 2 non-lands and 4 lands, losing 2 life, losing 2 rad counters, and letting Bilal put a +1/+1 counter on Mothman and Toski. He then plays an unclaimed territory, naming Tyrannid, and casts Rhythm of the Wilds, giving all his non-token creatures Riot and preventing his creatures from being countered. Finally, Doodle draws a card in his end step since he's still the Monarch. On my turn, I mill 2 lands and 4 non-lands, losing 4 life, losing 4 rad counters, and letting Bilal put a +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures. I then play a forest and cast Thorn Mammoth, which fights up to 1 creature whenever it or another creature enters under my control, but since the smallest other creature on board is a 10/10 Toski, I opt to not have it fight anything when it enters. On Jason's turn, he mills 2 lands and 4 non-lands, losing 4 life, losing 4 rad counters, and letting Bilal put a +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures. After that, he casts Adeline, Resplendent Cathar, which has power equal to the number of creatures he controls, and makes a tapped and attacking 1/1 human soldier token for each opponent whenever he attacks. Finally, he casts Golgari's Signet, plays a forest, and passes. On Bilal's turn, he draws a card, mills each opponent for 2, hitting 3 non-lands, putting a +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures. Then Bilal mills 2 lands and 4 non-lands for his own rad counters, losing 4 life, losing 4 rad counters, and putting another +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures. He then plays a swamp and attacks me for 21 with the Radgull, attacks Jason for 21 with Mothman, and attacks Doodle for 13 with Toski, giving each player another rad counter. Jason attempts to save himself by destroying Mothman with an Assassin's Trophy, but Bilal has a response, countering the removal spell with a Disallow. This means that Jason and I both get knocked out of the game, while Doodle takes 13 and, not seeing a way out of the situation, also decides to concede, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot going on in that game, and I think the very fast start from Bilal really pushed him toward the win. Being able to get a Soul Ring into a Talisman on turn 1 meant that he could get the Mothman online as early as turn 3, and that's not exactly what you want to hear from the rest of the table. So I think that we really struggled there. I know that our deck in particular struggled to keep creatures in play, because every time I played a big creature, which was almost always Vorinclex, it just got killed by the time it got back around to our turn, because it had to block Mothman or some other massive threat at the table, or it just got caught up in a board wipe. So we really just kind of got unlucky, I think. I think that overall we could have done a lot if we'd hit a couple of the cards that got milled out by the Mothman, but just wasn't our game. Jason's deck, I was very impressed by. Felithar is a card that I drafted multiple times in Dragonstorm Standard, and it is a powerhouse of a card, so I was very happy to see Jason just kind of pop off with it. I don't think he went quite as wide as he wanted to, again, kind of forced to chump block or chump attack to try to keep people's life totals in check, but very, very cool build nonetheless. I'm hoping we get to see Felithar again in the future. We already talked a little bit about Bilal's Mothman deck. Very powerful. Mothman did Mothman things, just grew really large. No one had removal that wasn't immediately countered, and it just ran away with the game. So a very impressive win by Bilal. And then, of course, last but not least, we have Doodle and his Tyranids. Kind of like us, Doodle really didn't do too much, unfortunately. He didn't draw as many creatures as I imagine he wanted to, and he was also kind of priced into blocking or being forced to sacrifice them to board wipes and things like that. So a little unlucky on his end, but definitely still a cool deck, and I would love to see more of the Swarm Lord in the future. Other than that, though, that brings us to the end of our video for today. So thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all for all of your support. If you have enjoyed the video, I would love it if you would like the video, subscribe to the channel, and as always, try to help us get to that 2,000 subscriber mark. We are so close, and I would love it if everyone could help us get there. Also, if you have any suggestions for future cards you would like to see built around, I absolutely love building these decks, even if they don't always get a video made for them, so please let me know down in the comments if you have any cool cards you'd like to see built around. Other than that, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed it. I know I certainly did. And I will see you on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.